Sam Wild, David Banica, welcome to the podcast. David, obviously, welcome back to the podcast. Thanks
Thank
for
you.
returning. Sam, first time podcast guest. It's great to have you on. We're going to be discussing a lot of things today. We're going to be discussing, obviously, your Prometheus artwork. We're going to be discussing the Power and Intimacy exhibition that you just took part in with several other great artists, including Fen de Villiers, who was just on the podcast. We're going to be discussing some spiritual implications of what the Prometheus art and icon represents. And obviously, this is a subject that I would be loath to talk about if I didn't have somebody like David on the podcast again. So thank you again, David, for being here. You can help blunt all of my weaknesses, and I'm excited to get you two talking as well. But before we go any further, Sam, if you wouldn't mind, I'd love for you to introduce yourself to the audience, tell people not only who you are, but what it is that you do, and then we can go from there.
Yes, I'm Sam Wild. I'm a painter and printmaker from England, part-time writer for Decadent Serpent sometimes. And we've been, myself and a group of artists have been putting on exhibitions now for 2 years, 2 exhibitions in total. Hopefully there'll be some more in the future, where we've been trying to challenge the art world and assert some higher values than what are being expressed at the moment by the current contemporary art establishment. So that's what we've been doing, and that's what I've been exploring in my work. Themes as mythology, in particular, which pertains to the Prometheus painting. So that's me, basically.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Prometheus painting, what went into the creation of it, but then also what it represents to you?
Yeah, sure. So 2 years ago, in 2023, we did our first show together as a group. That included works by various artists, but particularly Fen, who was on your show a month ago or something. And within that, he had a small sculpture called Prometheus in his characteristic style. And that was quite a bit of a topic at the time, the idea of Prometheus and Prometheanism, if you want to call it that, what this myth meant and its implications, particularly for today and where we are as a civilization. So I found that really inspiring. I found Fen's work really inspiring. So at that point, I started just drawing, as I usually do, just playing around with visual ideas, iconography. And then that eventually evolved into the Prometheus painting, which I wanted to explore those ideas, but also perhaps take it in a different direction from maybe where Fen took it. Fen's work is very physical and kinetic and based on the physicality of sculpture and three-dimensional space. But also I wanted to try and maybe take it into that idea of light, transcendence, colour, which is unique to the painting medium itself. So maybe perhaps in a way it's a kind of response to Fen's sculpture with something that's uniquely painterly, but also maybe taking it into a little bit of a different direction as well. So kind of my take on it, really. That's kind of where it came from. And it evolved eventually over 2 years. And I made the specific painting for the Power and Intimacy exhibition, which happened earlier this month. So,
David, I'd love to bring you in now. What are the spiritual implications behind Prometheus first as the story of the Titan, but then how it's depicted in art?
Yeah, so if you two will let me, I'll actually read a very good translation of the original myth of Prometheus. It won't take but 2 minutes. And then, David, if you let me, I actually want to pose the question to Sam before I add my own thoughts to what Prometheanism is or what it constitutes, because I want to understand how you, Sam, how you think of Prometheanism and how your artwork is placed within the normative tradition, air quotes, of Prometheanism and how it diverges from that. Because already, with your distinction between the physical and kinetic space of the statue, I'm making notes as we talk, and I found that very interesting. How you're sort of spinning that off and taking a different stance on that. So really quickly, gentlemen, I'll read. Now Iapetos took to wife the neat-ankled maid Clymene, daughter of Okeanos, and went up with her into one bed. And she bore him a stout-hearted son, Atlas. And also she bore very glorious Menopheus and clever Prometheus, full of various wiles, and scatterbrained Epimetheus, who from the first was a mischief to men who eat bread, for it was he who first took of Zeus the woman, the maiden whom he had formed. But Menetaeus was outrageous, and far-seeing Zeus struck him with a lurid thunderbolt, and sent him down to Erebus, because of his mad presumption and exceeding pride. And Atlas, through hard constraint, upholds the wide heaven with unwearying head and arms, standing at the borders of the earth before the clear-voiced Hesperides, for this lot wise Zeus assigned to him. So, we have a quick biography of some of the sins of the Titanic sons here. And ready-witted Prometheus he bound with inextricable bonds, cruel chains, and drove a shaft through his middle, and set on him a long winged eagle, which used to eat his immortal liver. But by night the liver grew as much again, every way as the long winged bird devoured in the whole day. That bird Heracles, the valiant son of shapely ankled Alcmene, slew, and he delivered the son of Iapetos from the cruel plague, and released him from his affliction, not without the will of Olympian Zeus who reigns on high, but that the glory of Heracles, the Theban-born, might yet be greater than it was before the plenteous earth. This then, he thought, and honored his famous son. Though he was angry, he ceased from the wrath which he felt before, because Prometheus matched himself in wit with the almighty son of Cronos. From when the gods and mortal men had a dispute at Mechane, even then Prometheus was forward to cut up a great ox, and set portions before them, trying to fool the mind of Zeus. Before the rest he set flesh and inner parts thick with fat upon the hide, covering them up with an oxen paunch. But for Zeus he put the white bones dressed up with cunning art and covered with shining fat. Then the father of men and of gods said to him, Son of Iapetos, most glorious of all lords, how, good sir, how unfairly you have divided the portions. So said Zeus, whose wisdom is everlasting, rebuking him. But wily Prometheus answered him, smiling softly and not forgetting his cunning trick. Zeus, most glorious and greatest of the everlasting gods, take whichever of these portions your heart within you bids. So he said, thinking trickery, but Zeus, whose wisdom is everlasting, saw and failed not to perceive the trick. And in his art he thought mischief against mortal men, which also was to be fulfilled. With both hands he took up the white fat and was angry at heart, and wrath came to his spirit when he saw the white ox bones craftily tricked out. It is because of this the tribes of men upon earth burn white bones to the deathless gods upon fragrant altars. But Zeus, who drives the clouds, was greatly vexed, and said to him, Son of Iapetos, clever above all, so, sir, you have not yet forgotten your cunning arts. So spoke Zeus in anger, whose wisdom is everlasting. And from that time he was always mindful of the trick, and would not give the power of unwearying fire to the Melian race of mortal men who live on the earth. But the noble son of Iapetos outwitted him, and stole the far-seen gleam of unwearying fire in a hollow fennel stalk. And Zeus, who thunders on high, was stung in spirit, and his dear heart was angered when he saw amongst men the far-seen ray of fire. You can clap now. So essentially what we see here is not only, the original trickery, not necessarily of humans, but, of divine beings, of the Titans against the gods. There's this original sin against the gods, the not just the trickery of, unsatisfactory sacrifice. This is usually called the trick at Menikos, but also the stealing of fire, of unwearying fire in a fennel stalk. And this unwearying fire has been translated and understood over the years, especially in the 12th century Renaissance, but also in the normative Italian Renaissance, as being knowledge, as being the technology, right? Especially in the alchemical tradition, Prometheus is understood as stealing that first sacred fire that's able to bring men wisdom and enlightenment about civilization. And then there's echoes of this in the Hebrew and Christian Old Testament of Tubal Cain, of the civilizing giants in the Old Testament. But very interestingly, in the Near Eastern interpretations of this, the monotheistic interpretations of this, the sin is more emphasized than the act of bringing civilization, of bringing the civilizing fire, of bringing the light that starts the fire of technology, of progress, as it were. And then obviously, and this carries on into the Christian tradition, the late medieval period. Prometheus isn't seen as this, a good guy necessarily, right? He's not this friend of humanity as he's interpreted in some pagan sources as. But then in the 12th century Renaissance, and then in the Italian Renaissance, all of a sudden we see this understanding, and not really all of a sudden. Obviously, it's an organic development about some of the interpretations of late antiquity and late antique paganism under Julian the Apostate. But really, Prometheus is seen as rebelling against evil pagan gods who tried to keep knowledge away from humanity. And he becomes rehabilitated, or there's an attempt at his rehabilitation as ultimately a friend of mankind, or a civilizational hero. And obviously, Hercules, who's the ultimate man, the man who achieves apotheosis. He becomes divine. He slays the torturers of Prometheus. One of the the most altruistic things that he does throughout his various labors and throughout his mythology. So Prometheanism then, and it's various manifestations and various definitions. I think when we talk of Prometheanism in the Western world, it's very much the triumph of man with technology, of this fire, this ultimate knowledge that we have within us. Right? We've taken that fire that only the gods had, which ultimately is the creative fire, the ability to create, the ability to maybe even give life in some circumstances, in some interpretations of this. But also, we have to understand the original sin part of this. Why was this viewed, in a negative way? Well, a lot of the early writers bemoan this. A lot of the early mythologists bemoan this because this is what separated us from the gods. This is what took us out of the mythical golden age. And Sam, you talk about pre-conscious existence, which we'll get to in a second, which is very interesting. I really liked your usage of that. But that's what ultimately constitutes almost a fall, almost an Edenic fall out of the good graces of the golden age of the gods. So that was a lot. That was a lot of word vomiting. But Sam, with that in mind, with a short genealogy of what maybe Prometheanism means in the Western tradition, where do you place your painting in this? How do you understand the relationship between your artwork and the wider Promethean tradition?
Well, my inspiration for Prometheus was very much inward in its focus. So it's not necessarily about debates about technology as such, but in the willpower and inward liberation of the individual vis-a-vis any kind of system that would stop the individual from achieving any kind of higher knowledge or any kind of higher freedom or transcendence. So for me, it was very much a spiritual inward quest about liberating the individual inwardly, rather than any kind of debate about maybe technology or transhumanism or something like that. And perhaps also there's a social aspect in that it would be relevant, I feel, for today and the kind of society, conformist society that we live in today, that would wish to capture your mind and have it in a particular place, just like Zeus wants to keep man in his place. So I feel a lot of our society wish to keep a lot of men in their place as well. So that was the kind of general impulse behind my work. I don't know what you think of that.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely a distinction from a lot of Promethean tradition, but it also falls neatly within it because obviously, just like how you counter not counter position, but maybe complementarily position Fenn's work as the physical kinetic space, where maybe his statue has more to do with the technological aspect or transhumanism. Obviously, that's a whole nother interview with him, maybe to clear that up. But with the inward spiritual movement, and you sent us this document really detailing a lot, which was very helpful, by the way. Thank you for that. Detailing a lot of your mental and inner background behind the painting, and you mentioned that it's not about transhumanism; it's about transcendence. So when you speak of spiritual transcendence and obviously loosening the bonds of the mind from the which obviously I applaud. I think especially in the West, that's something that we're struggling with very much so, right? And the eagle that eats the liver could be many things, but I think ultimately that's a lot of that has to do with various restrictions on not only how we're supposed to speak but how we're supposed to think, and that's where you're really taking this. So my I guess my question is transcendence to you, if it doesn't have the physical aspect of transhumanism, what transcendence do you look, because obviously that you look for in society or in the individual, because obviously it's a spiritual painting, obviously there's a spiritual impulse behind the painting, but what does that look like?
I think it's symbolized more less by fire in the case of Prometheus and more by light. So light is an odd element in that it is both physical and kind of non-physical in a way, or at least that's how it seems to us. And it obviously it sheds light, it clarifies, it shows us stuff that we would not otherwise see. And in that would be the kind of metaphor for transcendence that I would put forward, and I think it's put forward by my painting, is that that search for transcendent is a search for a kind of new light, a light that changes the aspects of the world as we see it or perceive it. It's interesting. There's the way light plays in paintings, and especially kind of in the 17th century in paintings by kind of Caravaggio or Vermeer, or in this time where there's a lot of spiritual revolution going on. That would be the kind of thing that they play with, both artistically and as a metaphor for a new vision of spirituality, of God, and of man's relationship to God. So I would say I was kind of reaching for that as a kind of idea or model of what transcendence means. And it's such a fundamental element, going to, I think someone called my Prometheus painting a kind of mix between William Blake and sci-fi. And if you think about the universe itself, the galaxies and solar systems, the whole kind of the major factor in that is light. Stars create light. It's kind of their characteristic. That's their main characteristic. So that would be the kind of fundamental metaphor for transcendence. I don't know what you think of that, David.
Yeah, so just to put all my chips out on the table, I should clarify two things. One, other David, podcast host David, and Sam are both professionals with credentials. So I have no academic credentials. I have no artistic credentials. So whatever I say, just sort of like take that as you will. Just for the audience. Like you don't need to listen to me. I'm just sort of here. I just get invited to these things. But on the second part, the rest of my chips on the table, I'm a Christian, and I consider myself a fairly little o Orthodox Christian. I actually belong to the iteration of the Church of England in the United States of America. Church of England is not necessarily famous for upholding spiritual renewal all the time, especially in light of events recent events, which I will not go into the details of. Um, but I'm very happy where I am. I'm very happy to be a Christian. I'm very happy with the Anglican devotional tradition. But I guess what I'm asking then is, when I hear spiritual revolution, the word revolution to me, as someone who views himself, in the amorphous right wing sphere of political philosophy, um, revolution is a concerning word to me, right? And not necessarily in this stodgy, stuffy, conservative sense of we can't ever change things. But revolution to me implies progression and progress. And I think you'd agree with this, Sam. Progress doesn't necessarily have a moral quality to it of being good. It's not necessarily good. It's not necessarily a bad. It's progress contextually gives itself meaning. So when you mean spiritual revolution, because you also said spiritual transformation, is that within the sense of organized religion? Is that within a current spiritual movement, or is this truly something else? I guess I want you to expand sort of on what your art trends to, what new transformations spiritually you see, because obviously I'm sure many of you have seen this, where there was a Substack recently that tries to rehabilitate Prometheus to the Christian tradition, right? That views Prometheus as a ultimately a Christian symbol where, Christ, or analogously, forgive me for blaspheming, Prometheus rebels against the god of this world, or Zeus, or ultimately Satan, right? And takes that light of revelation and gives it to humanity, or allows humanity to see that light of revelation. And that's very much in the sophiologist tradition. That's very much in the Russian cosmic tradition. Whereas the Orthodox, the Christian historical perspective has been to essentially see Prometheus as a sort of Lucifer, as this fallen angel who brings corrupting knowledge. It's still knowledge, right? But again, knowledge, just like progress, isn't always a net good. It doesn't always have the quality of goodness in it. It just is, right? Again, context defines what quality it imparts. So I guess, when you say spiritual transformation, and you've already intimated this, a rebelling against how people want us to think, which I applaud. I totally agree with you in that aspect of it. But where do you see this as a genuine spiritual movement?
I would say that it's difficult to know how art it would influence a culture or a civilization. I think we all kind of agree that it does, but we don't really know how that happens. So I can only express myself and put myself out there. Can't really control how people take the art and how it's taken up or anything like that. It's been nice for people to see people react very nicely to the painting, and especially younger people seem to really like it. Regarding transformation, revolution, I see Prometheus primarily as a tragic figure. There's, in the painting itself, there's a kind of intimation that Prometheus will be punished. There's a little Mount Olympus in the background. And I think the problem I have with kind of a lot of reactionary or traditionalist viewpoints is that it tends to freeze man as a being within a great chain of being, a static view that is doesn't really see us in a complete way or see our possibilities and what we can achieve. And I think it's often a little too realistic, a little too pessimistic. I don't think that people can live without any ideals at all, any idea of a future, or that there's any free will. But I would fully accept that comes with tragic consequences, that we don't know what kind of knowledge we're going to get until we get it. Obviously, we don't know in ignorance. We don't know what we're going to find, and we can't always control how that knowledge is used or stuff like that. So I fully acknowledge that it could be a tragedy, but I still think we need to embrace those ideals anyway, to embrace who we are as human beings and our innate free will. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely. No. That's a great answer. So, obviously, that very much fits in with traditional Prometheanism. I mean, even when Christian writers write about Prometheus, there always is this. That's a very human impulse, that want for knowledge, regardless of the consequences, even the tragic consequences. That brings us closer to Prometheus as a very human figure. As you know, we've all been punished, right? We touched the stove as a kid, not knowing the consequences of reaching out and touching the stove, and we get our hand burnt. And I think that's a very human impulse. So that no, that's a great answer. I think it's really interesting. I think this will get a lot of um, attention. What because you mentioned the great chain of being, and obviously you're familiar with that medieval Christian concept, this very Platonic or even Aristotelian worldview of a great chain of being. So that's very interesting that you mentioned that. I don't know, David. Do you want to jump in while I collect my thoughts, write a few notes down?
Yeah, so there's a few things I wanted to highlight that I think would be of interest to both of you, but also our listeners. This episode will be coming out on Halloween. And one way of thinking about Halloween is the gargoyles and the rafters of the church are, for one day, coming down to be in the center. You know, the bizarre edges of the pages in the beautiful book are now going to be the highlight for one day. One of the things that I think you're picking up on, David, and I'm curious, Sam, if you would agree with this, it seems to me that there is a rising interest in spirituality, but not within the Christian tradition, but more within a Hellenistic tradition. So this is something like a rise of paganism that is happening in the West, a rise of a quasi, almost Nietzschean, but if Nietzsche rejected the idea of slave morality, which I know he doesn't, but this idea that the thing that we're going to be celebrating is the thing that fits within a pagan mindset, but not necessarily a Christian mindset. And the reason that this springs to mind, especially with Prometheus, is that there is, and I don't agree with this interpretation, but there is an interpretation where Prometheus is not only the good guy, but he's a good guy in the same way that the serpent is a good guy or a good character in the garden, where God is this evil deity. And just like Prometheus steals the fire to help humanity, the serpent tries to bring that same fire, that knowledge of good and evil in the tree to Adam and Eve. I'd love to get your reaction to that, David, and see what you think about that. But then, Sam, as well, this idea of this rise of paganism and the celebration of Hellenism.
Yeah, well, just to that, I would answer with biblical language. There's nothing new upon the face of the earth. So when we talk about a rise, I think in a very Eliadean sense, and of course, I have to bring up Nietzsche Eliade because that's the only horn that I know how to play. It's a return of this sort of thing. Now, I would be careful though when I think you were right to place it within the framework or contextually for the audience as within Hellenic paganism. But I would just say the pagan impulse in general. And I think we had this new atheist movement that everyone was really excited about, and Ancient Aliens on the History Channel, right? But I don't think people actually took that very seriously. I don't know about you guys, but I didn't take it that seriously. Was it Richard Dawkins? I mean, you have to understand. Besides Sam, you can't just listen to every person with a British accent and think they're the smartest person in the world. Obviously, Sam is an exception to that rule. But I think we lost interest in that very quickly because there's still spiritual problems. There's still problems that cannot be fixed with just saying everything blew up out of nothing, right? That doesn't fix things in the human soul. That doesn't provide medicine to religious anxiety. That doesn't provide medicine to the ills of the consequences of the Industrial Revolution or of the sexual revolution, or of a lot of the revolutions in gender that we see today. or other things, or the confrontation of Western secular civilization with monotheistic Near Eastern religions like Judaism or Islam. It doesn't provide a solve to that. It doesn't fix any of the problems that we have. That doesn't answer any of the questions that we have with that. So I think it's very much within this post-Christian impulse. So it's not necessarily a religious impulse, like we're going into churches and putting a statue of Prometheus on it and calling it a Promethean church, right? Nobody's doing that. Sam isn't advocating for that. Sam, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think you view yourself as a Church of Prometheus person.
No, definitely not.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And I don't think Sam would even call himself a spiritual Prometheus, right? Identify with that spiritually. But there is this post-Christian spiritual impulse. And it's very much a lot of the same impulse that we see in the Italian Renaissance, where this dogmatism, this what's the word? Dogmatic theology, this scholasticism, it doesn't work. It's a framework that doesn't work for us. There is something more than just what Sam said, the great chain of being. We're not static. We're dynamic. We're dynamic humans. There has to be something bigger than this. And Eliade answers this a lot with looking past a lot of the conventions of Western European metaphysics. And obviously he's called an Orientalist for this, but that's not the point at all. It's just looking beyond the European decay. But I think, the impulse is there and the impulse is forming, which is why podcasts like this are so important, is because we're seeing things like the Promethean impulse, for example. Again, not to assign category, but just to identify, just to observe. A lot of sociology coming back up, a lot of people taking seriously some of the spiritual implications of crazy Russians like Alexander Dugin. Even if he was very smart, I think we can all admit he's also very insane. But essentially, we're seeing a lot of, even within Christian intellectual circles, I wouldn't say a move to heterodoxy, but maybe sort of what Milbank and David Bentley Hart are doing, radical orthodoxy, a movement to things that it can actually compete with a spiritual worldview that is increasingly post-Christian, because people are still religious. It's impossible not to be religious, but this religious impulse is just not being guided in the same way into the traditional institutions. And yes, there is a rise in converts to more traditional forms of Christianity, such as High Church Protestantism, Eastern Orthodoxy, Roman Catholicism. But I think ultimately that's not something David and I, as Christians, put our hope in. We don't put our hope in people converting to these things, because there's always when the church is ascendant, it's a very rare moment in history. It's a very great moment for us in history, but we know that it doesn't always last. We know that these cyclical time is cyclical. So I guess the way I see it, and especially with your language of spiritual transformation or revolution, is that, Christianity, maybe not as a whole, but Christianity institutionally and some of the worldviews that it authorizes or represents has just not done it. It's just not been able to meet the challenges of postmodern life. They're just, maybe in the spirituality, there's these answers, and in how we embellish on the spirituality, but within the institutions, within the dogma, it just doesn't exist, especially as we see, a lot of churches that use AI in the pulpit or use AI in the confessional booth. I mean, people don't want that. People want interaction with what you said, the transcendent, without the transhumanism. Now, obviously, I think Peter Thiel and Nick Land, people like these might want transhumanism, and that's not the goal of this podcast, is not to dog on them, although I wouldn't mind that. But I think that's my answer to your question, David. I definitely see Prometheanism, Nietzschean impulses, et cetera, and not even that they're bad, right? But just observing them in real time, reacting to what essentially, and I say this very consciously as a Christian, we haven't been responding to postmodern religious impulses. A lot of us do not have an answer to this. So I don't think we should be shocked when we see people looking towards classical pagan symbols, even if they're not consciously, like I said, offering milk libations to the god of lust, right? There's a search for something more real. There's a search for something more interactive than what a lot of institutional Christianity has been offering the world. So that long-winded answer, but that's my answer.
Sam, your take.
Yeah, I think people are looking for answers, especially in our age and where our civilization is at the moment. New technologies, people migrating from all sorts of places in the world. This is massively disruptive to the kind of boomer kind of civilization that preceded what we are coming from. Even that's kind of disruptive to that, and that wasn't entirely rooted, stable society. So people are looking for answers, and obviously they're looking back into the past to find those. I still think there's still a lot of people that are interested in Christianity, obviously, but I mean, it's one of the signal features of today is that the institution of the church can't really connect with just people that are spiritual, wanting to discover something spiritual for some reason. And it's especially David, with the Church of England is a notable example. In England itself, it's a completely bureaucratic, technocratic structure where it's kind of irrelevant if you actually believe in God or not. As long as you manage the church properly, that's how you rise in the hierarchy of that institution. And I think people can smell it. They can smell it a mile off that's not what they're looking for. And obviously they find it in, the rise of the interest in Friedrich Nietzsche over the last 10 years has been amazing. I started reading Nietzsche when I was 18 or something like that, a very long time ago. And people knew who he was and knew he was important. But now the internet is just, you can't shift for, people ascribing all sorts of stuff to Nietzsche. And I think that is all part of this, searching for something higher, something broader, something that can give people an anchor or some kind of meaning in life. And Nietzsche is the kind of the perfect foil against institutional Christianity, right? Is the deepest critic of Christianity, far deeper than Richard Dawkins or this kind of rationalist philosophy, which is nowhere now. You can hardly find anyone who's a kind of Reddit rationalist anymore. So people are interested in these kind of deeper answers. They're interested in myths in general, I think. The Greek myths are particularly powerful ones, and so are the biblical ones as well. I don't know what you guys think. Do you think that the Greek myths are the Greek and the biblical myths contradict each other completely, or is there a harmony possible between them? Or will people be, when people are on this spiritual discovery, will they have to make a choice between Hellenistic paganism or mythology and biblical stories or narratives? Do you think, or is there some kind of harmony between them?
David, help us synthesize Neoplatonism.
Yeah, so obviously Neoplatonism is a loaded term. A lot of the Neoplatonists would say, "Oh, we're just normal Platonists," but that's neither here nor there. I think in terms of a lot of the essences of pagan Platonism, and theurgy and alchemy and magical practices, and a lot of what's implied in the New Testament. I think it's important not to view the Old or New Testament as essentially part of a Near Eastern world. And I know that's not a popular thing to say or to understand it as, but I think they both essentially belong to this Hellenistic Mediterranean tradition. And I think there's a lot of features shared even with some later Egyptian religious developments. And I think, this is a fascinating thing to bring up because this is exactly what happens during the Italian Renaissance. We have this inheritance, this pagan inheritance, right, that offers so much, and that we should, as Europeans, as products of Western civilization, we should be very proud of Ovid. We should be very proud of Plato and Socrates and Aristotle and Pythagoras. But there's also intimations in the New Testament of a different revelation, of a higher calling, of a higher revelation. So, do you have to ultimately make a choice between the Old Testament heroes and the Greek heroes? Yes, you do. But not as much, I don't think as much of a choice as you think you need to. I think, if you're one of the Disney Marvel movie types, you probably think there's more of a divide than there really is. Like, obviously, you can't call yourself a Christian, although some did. Some did. Marsilio Ficino in the Renaissance certainly did. If you have a little statue of Hermes and you're reading Bible quotes to the statue of Hermes and then, burning incense around it, obviously we can't be doing these things, right? I don't even think they do that in the Church of England, although I might be wrong. Hopefully not, right? But I think yes. I think the good Christian answer is yes, but I think Plato, especially, in a lot of Plato's discussions and a lot of Socratic dialogues on what love is, seems to intimate the good, the all good, the one God. And obviously, there are people that are much more qualified to speak on this than I am. But a lot of the Renaissance synthesis, a lot of why the zodiac appears everywhere in Renaissance art, where you have churches in Rome that the pulpits of Roman Catholic priests show the zodiac star signs under which they were born, and you have figures, and this is a very important book, both for the two of you and our audience. The Survival of the Pagan Gods of the Renaissance by Jean Sesnek. Very, very good work to understand this. There is a synthesis, but I think it's hard. It's hard. This is a difficult thing to synthesize because as a little o Orthodox Christian, I will never tell you to go pray to Hercules, and I would never tell you to emulate a lot of what some of the Greek heroes do. But as we've been discussing, for example, the Church of England, and as we've been discussing institutional bureaucratic Christianity, especially with the Lutheran state churches in Sweden and Norway, where you don't even have to believe in the Bible to become a bishop, right? There's no answers. There's not even a meet you in the middle. There's not even a let's talk about other things. And I think when we speak of this synthesis of rejecting, it's not a rejection of everything the Greek gods are. It's not a rejection of a classical inheritance. It's not a rejection of good knowledge, because there is pagan knowledge that's good. And if you don't believe that as a Christian, you might be a Baptist. I don't know. You don't have the fullness of the understanding. And the impulse behind that, the theological impulse behind that is, well, God created all things. God is ineffable. He's transcendent. He penetrates all things. There's this concept called panentheism, where God contains everything, and in some way he is pierced into everything, or he holds all things within him. So the wisdom of God, the revelation of God, the revelation even of Christ, even though it is special to the church, it is special to the Bible, has now become general revelation, and that's been a truth forever, outside of time, essentially, outside of the way that we configure and the way we record time. So, of course, in other religions and in other traditions, there's going to be intimations of this. Especially Plato gets close to this, and it seems as though, and I'm not fully familiar with it yet, it seems as though Chinese Taoism, has a lot of these intimations. It seems at one point they even got close to the doctrine of a Trinity, right? Which is, again, very important to understanding Christ and the Godhead in its fullness. And I think that even though, yes, you cannot pray to Hercules and to Christ, I think that there are enough people, and I think that there's enough momentum um, of people that don't understand it that way, that don't believe in it that way, that think that there is that gray space, that there's this gray area. And it's eerily like late antiquity under Julian the Apostate, where there were, you know, Greek pagans that were like, yeah, I'll bring Christ into my pantheon, or I believe it was Saint Paul, or it might have been Saint Peter, David, the one of the saints that spoke in Athens, and he addresses the Athenians. You have this statue, this idol to the unnamed God. I'll tell you who that is. That's Christ. That's the Trinity. That's the Godhead. And they're like, yeah, sure, let's do that. Throw him in the pantheon too. Why not? So I think, do you have to reject the pagan gods to get to Christian truth? Yes. Do you have to reject all the truth within paganism to also be a Christian? No. Because truth is truth. And truth in the Christian understanding ultimately comes from one source, and that is God. So if something is true, it comes from Christ. Now, there's variations of truth. There's grades to truth. But yeah, that's a hard question, Sam. Come on, man. I thought we had an understanding. I gave him 20 euros before this meeting to not ask me hard questions.
Yeah, no, David, you're making a lot of great points. One of the other things that I would just add to this, not to sound like Jonathan Pajot, but that might come up at some point. There is an incredible amount of symbolism, to echo David's point, that you can pull from a lot of these stories where there is truth. We obviously believe that that's from God. In the Christian worldview, we believe that God is sovereign over all. There's no passage in the Bible that says, and God was surprised in Genesis when Eve eats the apple. God doesn't go, I never saw that coming. You won't find that. So when these examples of natural revelation happen, we take them as good. And interestingly, not to steelman paganism, but the pagans are much closer to what I believe is ultimately true, much more so than the secular atheists, and certainly probably more so than the, I'm sorry to say, heretical Church of England based on the family values of Henry VIII.
You guys are going to get me in trouble with my bishop, man. It's okay. He's retiring. That's fine.
Doesn't this suggest that today in modernity, there's a kind of poverty within our concept of God or the divine? I mean, both pagans and Christians historically have had like a sublime concept of God as a kind of as the creator of all things, whereas today, in today's modern technocratic civilization, God is like at most a kind of placeholder for a good social ethic, a bit like Kant's idea that God is just like a kind of lawgiver, or kind of deist kind of thing, where it's just the kind of starts the system off, and we're kind of finishing it in this social system. And I think that is partly what people are kind of rebelling against in a way. That's thin gruel for people, spiritually speaking. They need an idea of a spiritual force within the universe that is more than just telling them how they should treat a refugee, or what's the best time to get married, or something like that. I think people are looking for something more sublime, something more greater than that. I don't know what you guys might think of that both ancient Christians and ancient pagans had a higher form of spirituality than today.
Well, the thing that immediately comes to mind when you mentioned the technocrats, and David, I'd like to bring you in on this because this is a point you've made before. It seems to me that there is an attempt to create a new god, at least in the language that's being used to speak about artificial intelligence. It's spoken about as if it is a living thing and not a large language model program imitating humans. This is obviously also, it pertains to the debate that's happening around art, where you have these AI generated images that look fake and people recognize that they're fake, but there's a certain sect of people that are going into that and going, oh, wow, this is amazing. This is the thing that I ask all life
Idiots.
questions for. And you're the striking thing, and I'm making David's point for him, but and you can elaborate on this. But when you ask these large language models questions, and you essentially are participating in this religious ritual of prayer, question, and answer, you are getting responses back, but where are those responses coming from? David, you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, so the category of people that you're talking about that that are okay with AI generated art, they're called idiots, just as an academic term. Spiritually depraved zombies, however you want to call them, but that's my preferred term of endearment. So I'll answer both because I think Sam brought up a very very good point about how there's this poverty in a lot of Christianity, a lot of modern understandings, not even of Christians, but very affected by an elaborated Christian worldview, like Hegel or like Kant's pose. And Mircea Eliade has this quote. He says, "If it's actually not even a quote in like that he's written out in the book, it's a footnote, his own footnote to one of his quotes. If there are no miracles, it is only the fault of Christians, not the fault of Christianity." And so there's, the ways in which people have interpreted Christianity, like Kant, and like what a lot of the Enlightenment does. The Enlightenment is like, you know what? Christianity is great for social convention. It's great for, political cohesion. But other than that, like, you people don't actually believe in demons or fairies, do you? But the Christian worldview is that absolutely the pagan gods are real. I'm a firm believer that Prometheus is real. Is Prometheus actually tied to a rock and an eagle is pecking at his liver? No, probably not. But there is a spiritual impulse. There is the recognition of spirituality there. So in that way, yes, Prometheus is a literal spiritual entity. Again, that's a poor word to use, a ghost hunter's word to use. But just to sort of communicate that the Bible fully believes this. And I'm sure you've read the Old Testament when the holy prophet Moses, or Saint Moses, confronts Pharaoh and confronts the magicians of Pharaoh, and God, or Old Testament Yahweh, brings the 12 plagues upon Egypt. The 12 plagues correspond to the gods of Egypt that represent the Nile, that represent frogs, that represent pestilence. So it's this acknowledgement, even on the behalf of God, that there are powers, like the Bible says, powers and principalities. And then, when we look over at the Persian exile of the Israelites, and we see, the prophet Daniel praying to God for, I believe it was 30 days on end, and then he's visited by an angel. And that angel says, "I wasn't able to get to you because I was held up in the air by the prince of Persia." Not a reference to the movie, of course, but a reference to the spiritual force that is placed over Persia as a nation, as a territory. So there's very much a multiplicity, not of God, not of gods, right? Not in the same way that we approach the Godhead, but of spiritual beings. And I think we've lost that. I think we've lost that understanding, in part because of what Christian theologians have done to our own religion and what we've believed. And we've, over the centuries, we've caved into these cultural impulses of, no, it's a rational religion. If Christianity was a rational religion, there's no point. Leave the church. Throw the Bible in the mud. If this is all rational, if this just makes you feel happy when you get up in the morning, so does smoking a cigarette. I mean, what are we doing this for? The Bible is deeply irrational to the hearts of men. It implies very harsh metaphysical truths that are not acceptable to the likes of Richard Dawkins, that are not acceptable to modern man. And like you said, a lot of that is disappearing. Nobody believes in Reddit rationalism anymore. Postmodern man is looking for this, and we've discussed this before, and it's a loaded term, but I'll use it, muscular Christianity, of an enchanted world, of a world where, like in H.P. Lovecraft's fiction, the planets are literally alive. There's literally horrific things out there in the universe that we have to confront ourselves with. So that's answer the Sam's intimation of what do we do with this. And David, can you remind me of your question? I'm so sorry, I got lost ranting.
When you are chatting with the large language models and you are participating in this prayer ritual, the thing that answers back, in a sense, is actually real.
Don't ask Grok anything. Don't engage with ChatGPT. Don't engage with Meta. Don't do it. And I'm so serious about this. Um, a lot of that, Kantian, let's go back to Kant, that Kantian impulse of that, well, God has started the clock, we'll have to wind it up a few times. We'll get it to the finish line, replace the batteries, and we'll, or with Hegel, we'll immanentize the eschaton eventually. There's this agency and this transcendence that's assigned to human action that does not exist in actuality. What we're trying to do is give sacrality and the element of sacredness to a thing that has never had that. We go back to Eliade's concept of archaic man. Archaic man did things because the gods did them. He plowed the earth because the gods plowed the earth. He did sacrifices because Prometheus set up these sacred sacrifices. What god invented the computer? Show of hands. Does anybody know? No, you guys don't know. Okay, right? This is what I'm getting at. Which god created the cotton gin? And obviously you can apply this in a very naive way to all technology ever. What god invented the plow? We shouldn't do farming. But with AI, we've superseded the Industrial Revolution. It's not about the mechanics of AI. It's what isn't mechanical. It's what's non-material. These electrical impulses, the way in which AI obviously it does collect data, it does collect language, it does simulate back to us our own language. But if we understand the faculty of language as part of consciousness, and this goes back to your talking about your Prometheus artwork as pre-consciousness, what are we to say that there isn't a spiritual element going on here? This is very obviously some of the Hermetic alchemy that was engaged in the Italian Renaissance. Alchemists said that, no, I could literally draw spirits out of thin air, have them be infused into a statue, and that statue will start speaking back to me. Now, it won't be an actual God speaking to me. It's still the statue, but the ability to speak has now been infused in that statue. I'm sorry, gentlemen, but I don't have to connect, A to B for both of you. What does this sound like? This sounds like AI. This sounds like typing in an answer into Grok and getting an answer back. And I don't want to be gin-brained about this and superstitious, but it's very much the same impulse. We are trying to reach for transcendence. How do we know how to interact with things other than ourselves? Well, machines are suprahuman, right? We create them, but in many ways, they've certainly become their own thing, certainly become their own agency. There was this article I read a while ago that spoke specifically about how we talk about cars. When we get in a car accident, oh, that guy hit me. No, he didn't. He hit your car. But we've assimilated cars so much into everyday life, into how we act and think and speak, that car is now an extension of me. That's now a part of me. I'm not okay with that. I'm not okay with integrating AI into how I think, act, and speak. I don't even like saying the words artificial intelligence. That's just, those words put together, to me, are so spiritually evil and depraved. Artificial and intelligence, the light that we understand, that even Prometheus understands as coming ultimately from the gods, is now essentially coming out of thin air, is essentially coming out of human action, leaving what we've done, leaving our authority and leaving our power. Are we okay with that? Are we okay with letting computers gain this sort of intelligence, this sort of faculty? And I think the reason why a lot of people are is because there's such a sacred view, there's such a importance placed on individual human action, that individual human action brings about the transcendent. It brings about the divine, when that's never been the traditional understanding of it. So that's part of why I have such an issue with AI of any sort. I tell people at my university, like, don't even use AI to like correct your essays. Like, do not feed the beast. Do not engage with the beast. Obviously, for different people, it can be a tool, but I think it's one of those tools that's just so. I mean, when we talk about nuclear power, we're scared of our bodies being, dissolved into dust. What about our souls? This to me is a spiritual nuke, and I, for one, do not intend on pressing the red button.
Sam, how do you feel about pressing the button?
Yeah, no, I agree with David in a way. It's interesting to go just to backtrack a bit to the role of art in all this. So, I mean, I think the director Christopher Nolan said about his film Inception that what he found fascinating about a dream was that when you're in a dream, you're only interacting with yourself, even though it seems as if you're interacting with other people or you're in a situation or something like that. And that's how kind of AI is really. You're only really speaking to yourself. It's only projecting to yourself. And like the Renaissance alchemist, you're probably just having an hallucination about a statue, to be honest. There's nothing really going on there. Whereas with art, I feel art is about dreams, but it's about dreams in a very different way. It kind of presents you with an image of a dream, which an artist has composed, thought about what this image is representing, what it's expressing, and then the viewer themselves translates that image within their own imagination. So we have with AI, and why it's so foolish to create AI art is because you're not crafting a imaginative image that communicates a dream to someone. You're kind of within the dream itself. Does that make sense? That these two modes, art and AI, are completely different ways of talking about, dream image and about the imagination and the spiritual horizon that we live on.
Well, something I want to ask you, just continuing that thought for a moment about the creation process. I've had performances where I've obviously practiced and was very cognizant and conscious of what I was doing. But when I got onto the stage, when it came time for the actual art to flow, there's a sort of Zen state where I know I'm playing and I recognize what's happening, but the thing that's flowing through me is not actually me. And that doesn't happen all the time, but there's certain creative moments that I have where the intentionality that I once had in that process is no longer there. The thing flowing through me almost seems to come from someplace else. I don't know if you've had this experience in painting. I think Fen described a similar experience when he's sculpting. But could you talk a little bit more about what that creative process looks like?
Yeah, I mean, I think scientists and theorists have called it a kind of flow state, right? When it's perfect, you're perfectly balanced between something being stimulating and yet not too difficult for you to do. And so you're in this kind of perfect Goldilocks zone of being able to do this task without even thinking about it. And I think all artists, I think not even artists, it could be anybody. I'm sure David, if David writes a lot or something like that it's the same thing. You're not even conscious of your own self being there. And I think it's hugely important to art. And it's a very odd experience to dive into because in a way you wouldn't, it's the kind of secret source to art. It's something that we can't really do without. We can't really explain it. We're terrified that we might lose it because it's not, in a sense, it's not even really conscious. I don't know what you find when you're playing cello or any kind of musical instrument. It's not exactly voluntary either. Sometimes it's a slog, sometimes it's not. But I think there's something beautiful about that, but there's something kind of healthy about the way that is expressed. You kind of lose yourself. and who you are and your consciousness of your self-consciousness. Whereas when people are interacting with AI or with kind of virtual simulations like that, they do kind of lose themselves in a way, but it doesn't seem like it's in a healthy flow state. It seems kind of weirdly circular and masturbatory. I don't know if you feel the same way, or if you get that impression. But yeah, it's hugely important.
Yeah, it's interesting. You can convince. Probably to David's chagrin, so I apologize. But I have played around with dialoguing with some of these machines to see if I can get them to break their own software. There's a few fun ways that you can do that. You can play little moral tricks on it. It'll for a moment.
Where did I put my cigarette?
Yeah, it will try and not make moral claims, but as soon as you say something that's contrary to whatever the modern status quo is, all of a sudden it becomes this striking moral distinction between certain ideas. So that's been my experience with it. I've encouraged all of my students at the college to stop using it. I was very intentional in how I don't want to say scolded, but let's say strongly discouraged students from using it. I recently we had a test, and the test material was easy, and I purposely made it easy so that students would just practice writing, practice expressing themselves through their words. And instantly I could tell who used AI and who didn't, because people who didn't use AI, even if it was poor grammar and poor spelling, it was their individual voice on the page, and the AI all sounds the same. There's no better word for it, I think, than slop. And I mean that in the literal sense, slop that you feed to pigs, actual garbage. So that's one of the reasons, it's not even the most important reason, but one of the reasons I discourage people from using AI in that sense. Also because it just gives you bad information. It will give you false information. That's something I've been able to catch, obviously, because I actually go back and check sources and use the links that it provides. It's like, oh, it actually provided a lot of false information, but people are so used to already using AI for that sort of writing slop regurgitation, almost bulimic education in that sense. David, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I'd love to bring you into that.
Yeah, I mean, I switched my major program because I'm a history major, and I actually switched from international relations because our professor required us to use AI as part of the learning course. It was a requirement for essays. Basically, the gist was, I won't intimate the identity of the professor, but you will only get not you will get lower than an A in this class only because you chose not to use AI. And all of the lesson plans were made using AI. The learning outcomes were AI generated essentially. And first of all, that's not an education. That doesn't count. Second, I don't know, just put a helmet on me and call me a retard. Like, what sort of patronizing? I'm paying for this education, and you're telling me to use AI. And it's just so frustrating because beyond the spiritual implications, of which I'm still convinced, and beyond some of the artistic implications that you've both talked about, the implications for higher ed, which is already, I mean, it's already so hollowed out and corrupted in so many places, unfortunately. Unfortunately, in many places, although, the liberal arts, it's still very important to me, and obviously it's very important to the three of us. In many places, it's become a byword for a poor education, or for nonsense, right? Or for indoctrination, right? It's an ideological education, not an actual education. Um, it really commodifies learning. It drags everyone down to the same level, and that's what they want, right? That's sort of what Sam was talking about in the beginning. Those bonds. It's really the bonds of equality, and I mean that in every sense. Misinterpret that however you want, because you're probably not misinterpreting that. I truly mean that. There is no equality in nature. Even in the Christian religion, there's this understanding that they're Archbishop Archbishop Ramsey. He was Archbishop of the Church of England, and he wrote a manual for priests. And even in that manual, where he's like, yes, liberal democracy is good, he still acknowledges that I don't believe in the lie of human equality. And that doesn't mean human worth, right? Let's distinguish that. All humans are made in the image of God. There is value to every human, and there's intrinsic respect deserved to every human. That does not mean we're all equal in ability. If I picked up a pen and tried to, scratch Prometheus onto a napkin, it'd be really bad. If I tried playing the cello, it would be really bad beyond, the gypsy allegations being correct. It wouldn't sound very well. You know what I mean? It wouldn't sound good. And I could learn these things, but I could try as hard as I might. I could read all the leadership books. I could read all the, Cello 101 for Dummies or Promethean Paintings 101 for Dummies. If I don't have that talent, if I don't have that intrinsic talent, I'm not going to get very far. I could be technically fine, but the inspiration that comes from the Power and Intimacy art exhibition would not be mine. The power of going into that flow state of a concert would not be mine. I would just be repeating things. And that's a lot of what AI does. It really removes that level of that human divine spark, because it's non-human, right? It's superhuman, something other than us. And that's what I think a lot of the issue comes in with looking for the divine in AI. I think for now, I think we can argue against it in these very vociferous ways, because it's clearly not reached a point where it's superior to human talent, to human knowledge, to how we express spiritual and dreamlike truths, as Sam was saying. But what my worry is, what I'm very concerned about, is that we're not very far off from that. We're not very far off from AI achieving this transcendence to it. And I think we've already crossed some lines. Again, I don't think we're fully there. I don't think we've reached, what's the word that Tesla guy uses, that Elon Musk uses?
Singularity, is it? Or
Singularity.
like
Thank you. We haven't achieved that yet, and I don't think we should. I also don't think it's impossible, and that's a spiritual and corporeal reality that is very worrisome. And obviously, as a Platonist, I value the spiritual things in this world. As a Christian Platonist, I value the spiritual things in this world. But we have a body for a reason. Sam, you were created with the hands that you have to pick up the brush and pick up the ink pen for a reason. David, your fingers play the cello for a reason, right? There's a plan to it all. And there's a plan for the human body. There's a plan for human consciousness. And I believe this as a Christian. So to remove these elements, and what's even more terrifying is people like Peter Thiel consciously identify as Christians, or as Christians of some sort. Obviously, in the same way that Kant or Hegel are Christians, they're not. But they have this iteration or this idea of Christian identity to where they can, put on a demographic sheet of paper. Yes, I'm a Lutheran. Yes, I'm a Calvinist. Whatever, call it a day. So I think that's, beyond just the educational worries, artistic worries. That's where a lot of my anti-AI, my reactionary, my old man with a cane, impulse comes from. But what I really like about the work that Sam is doing, and people like Fen, and even Ruxandra is doing with some of her artistic work, is that all of you as artists are looking into the past to build a future. And that's not what the modern impulse is at all. The modern impulse is burn it all. None of it mattered. What happened a generation ago, what happened 5 years ago is old. It's outdated. It's outmoded. We don't need it anymore. But what people are finally realizing is that modernist impulse is leaving them empty. It's leaving them hollow. They don't know what to do with themselves. That's why you see in England, in the Netherlands, this, the MAID, right, the assisted suicide. If I lived in a world that was not enchanted, if I lived in a world where I thought there was no God and that Richard Dawkins had the full revelation of truth, I'd be suicidal, and that's what's happening to a lot of Western civilization. I don't think it's hopeless, though. I'm very, very optimistic. And as a Christian, you have to be an optimist. This is sort of where you have to kind of ignore Kierkegaard and look towards the future a little bit. And Sam, you've talked about this optimism within Prometheanism, which I think is great and beautiful, and that's why I'm not willing to condemn um, the Promethean impulse at all. Obviously, I have some issues with maybe calling it a Christian symbol. I think we might go a little too far there, and obviously, I think that it's also a currently developing impulse. It's a currently developing movement. So to assign it to any category would be wrong and unfair of me. But I do have a lot of sympathy for it, and I do think that first of all, again, congratulations on the art exhibition. It looked like it went very well. It looked like it was very well received. Now you just have to tell all your other art friends to follow me back on social media so I can feel important. I'm kidding. But that's just sort of to, I guess, give more context to the audience for why the three of us are here. We might be of different spiritual traditions or opinions or backgrounds, but we all recognize these movements. We all recognize that in many ways there's a need for the Promethean impulse in this day and age, because the gods of this world, in the Christian sense, are evil. And Sam, you recognize this too within your work, breaking the shackles of how ideological dictatorships want you to think. And in many ways, it's spiritual, right? It's all spiritual. These are spiritual shackles. They want to keep your spirit down. So yeah, just to sort of round out everything that I've been mentioning and talking about, just so the audience thinks I didn't bring in Sam and David here to yell at them.
Well, one more thing I think to help finalize the rounding of the point. Yes to everything. I think the only thing that I would not necessarily chafe with, but nuance, I don't feel worried. The times that we are in are difficult, but I can't think of a time in history where that wasn't true. The problems of our time are unique in one sense, and also a modern repeat of problems that have happened in the past. It's exciting. This recognition of why spirituality, at the very least, is important. This recognition of the return of the pagan gods, the recognition of why Christianity is important, the weirdness and the strangeness and all that comes with that is extraordinarily interesting and exciting. And there is a lot of opportunity. And as a Christian, yeah, I obviously agree. I'm not even remotely cynical or pessimistic. I am very optimistic. And even when horrible things happen, there is a recognition in Christianity that I spoke about this with Ruxandra, since you mentioned her, that the currency of life is suffering and sacrifice. And there's a heavy toll that has to be paid with that. But it's also an epic and adventuresome life. And I would want to include that in the image we are, at least right now, painting with our words. Sam, before we go, I would love to, the question I'm always asking people at the end of each podcast is, what is a practical vision that you have for people moving forward? You've obviously had this very successful art exhibition. You sold a lot of work, and there was a lot of recognition both in London as well as online. I saw Alexander Adams is going around and has been being interviewed on TV. Fenn is obviously doing a lot of promotional work, and obviously you as well. Pitch us a vision. How do we move forward practically with everything that we've been either talking about here or with the work that you all are doing?
I think the practical vision is to keep, creating art and supporting art. Keep learning about art and get into it. The broader we build this kind of emerging, kind of new high culture that is emerging online in different places in the US, in Europe, in Britain, the more younger people we can intrigue and invite in to this space and to talk about the ideas that we've been talking about today, the better. The more shows we can put on in art, the more concerts that we can put on, the better. That requires also, though, the support of elites in supporting that, in providing funding and other resources to make that go forward. So, inviting young people in to consider these issues, to learn about art and music, and to get into those things. And they're being betrayed really by the institutions at the moment, which are starving them of that. And I think there is a real potential and hunger for the arts in young people, serious arts, high arts, and also, convincing our somewhat Philistine elites to support us too. So something, those kind of two, young people and elites, I think, are the people we need to support the arts, really.
Sam Wild, David Banica, this has been a genuine pleasure. The first three-way conversation on the Artisan Parlor. Thank you so much, David, as a returning guest. Always immensely enjoy your work. I expect we'll all be talking and collaborating again at some point. But for now, thank you both. Appreciate it.
It was very fun.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you, guys.